My name is Jen Karsten, and I have the joy of serving as Executive Director here at Pendle Hill. And on behalf of our community, I would like to thank each of you for coming out tonight to hear Bill Graustein deliver the 2014 Cary Lecture. The Stephen Cary Memorial Lecture is made possible by Norval and Ann Reese and was established in 2004 following the publication of a book of Steve Cary's writings, The Intrepid Quaker, One Man's Quest for Peace, available in the Pendle Hill bookstore. It's our joy to see Betty and Dorothy Cary, along with the Reeses, here with us tonight. And I'm sorry if that embarrasses anybody. It's my observations that Quakers can be a little bit shy, a little bit uncomfortable being put in the spotlight. And I suppose the only way for me to remedy having done that to you four is to spotlight everybody, which I will do now. Could I ask you to raise your hand if you are a current or former staff member at Pendle Hill? Could I ask you to raise your hand if you are a current or former student at Pendle Hill? Current or former teachers? Pamphlet authors? Okay, we're going to need some more pamphlet authors. I only saw 2 hands. Whatever that idea is, talk to Shirley afterwards, please. How about event attenders? Yeah, you're here, right? Weekend workshop participants or sojourners? Hello. Volunteers? Resident family members? How about board members? That's right. Wow. Welcome back. Is there anybody that I've missed? Anybody who hasn't had their hand in the air yet? Okay. Who are you? You're being called out from across the room. You've been here before. So, Bill, now you know who's in the room with you, and I'd like to tell them a little bit about you now, if that's okay. Bill's hometown is New Haven, Connecticut, and he's been a member of New Haven Friends Meeting for 40 years now. After 25 years as a geologist, Bill left scientific research to devote his time to work in the nonprofit sector, starting in 1993 when he led the reorganization of his family's foundation, the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund. For 10 years, from 2001 to 2011, he chaired the Board of Public Allies, a national organization that advances the leadership of young adults with attention to diversity. In 2011, he and Neonu Span founded Co-Creating Effective and Inclusive Organizations to support New Haven community movements and nonprofit organizations. In 2002, he created a workshop series, which he still leads, called the Community Leadership Program for civic and nonprofit leaders in New Haven. And one question that guided the development of that program was Bill asking himself, can what I've learned in Friends practice be transplanted to a secular setting? And we can see that that question has continued to work on Bill because his title tonight is called Prophets and Nonprofits, Tending Quaker Seeds in Secular Soil. But what I really want to tell you about Bill is that when I first met him a few years ago, I was new in this role, and we met for lunch. And I asked him if he had any counsel for me, as I was hopeful of living into this role, seeking to live into service in this place, which sometimes acts as a hub for dialogue and multi-perspective understanding. And he replied that something that had been helpful to him is a simple, he didn't call it a mantra, but I will, invite story and share story. It's a simple but powerful guidance, and it's helped me remember that so much of getting past our differences and into a place of real connection with each other and really with everyone we meet is based on authentically hearing each other. And I know that you came to authentically hear from Bill and not from me. So let me just say a quick word about our lecture format, and then I will sit. It is our custom to hear from our speaker and then to invite him or her to ask for your questions or reflections. And When that time comes, my hope is that you'll raise your hand and allow us to bring a microphone to you. We are recording tonight, and that will make our recording devices able to capture your thoughts. And if you could hold the microphone very close to your face and not away from here so that we can hear you, that would be very helpful. And the final piece is that we begin each lecture by settling into a worshipful silence and letting the message come when it's ready. So I'd like you to please join me now in welcoming Bill's message in this quiet way.
Thank you for the warm welcome. Prophets and non-prophets, tending Quaker seeds in a secular soil. Actually, we'll try and get to all of the topics that the title kind of outlines. But I wanted to kind of just begin a little bit by reflecting on what the meaning of a gathering like this is. I asked Norval Reese if I could talk to him. I was curious what his hopes were for the lecture and what his memories were of Steve Cary, what Steve's inspiration had been. And if I may quote from the email that you sent me, Steve was a close friend of ours. We sailed together, fished together, socialized frequently. Steve read the wedding certificate for our combined Episcopal Quaker wedding in Grace Episcopal Church in Salem, Massachusetts, many years ago. In larger terms of Pendle Hill and Quakers, Steve was the kind of Quaker I keep in mind when trying to live my faith in a complex world. Steve started from a deep religious core, which compelled him to act, instead of having his religion defined by the testimonies or social action. You could debate with him all day long, still disagree, and end up laughing with him at his jokes of the evening. So I think this really is a celebration, both of the human connections that we share with friends, but it's also a chance to revisit our past so that we can kind of move into the future with clearer intention. And I think this sort of form of ritual, this I think is in a way a ritual gathering. I think it's also a creative process. David Brooks wrote a piece just a couple weeks ago in the op-ed in the New York Times. He'd been to a TED conference where Sting, the musician, gave a presentation where he described a time when he had run into a creative dry spot and went back and revisited his hometown. Here's what David Brooks wrote. Most TED Talks are about the future, but Sting's was about going into the past. The difference between the two modes of thinking stood in stark contrast. In the first place, it was clear how much richer historical consciousness is than future vision. When we think about the future, we don't think about the texture and the tensions, the particular smells, shapes, and conflicts, the dents in the floorboard. Going back is a creative process. The events of childhood are like the Hebrew The events of childhood are like the Hebrew alphabet. The vowels are missing, and the older self has to make sense of them. When we go back in memory, we get to impose narrative order on choices that didn't seem so clear at the time. And we get a great deal of freedom to rethink and deconstruct and joke about and change the narrative so it's a guide that suits us better as we try and move into the future. So I'm really honored and delighted that Anne and Norville, Reese, and Betty Cary can be here. And I hope that this, they find that this helps both honor the memory and also keep the future in front of us and alive. I'm going to talk a little bit in the same sense about going back to revisit things, about how I came to do the work that I do. And in doing this, I trust that you'll be able to hear more about the textures and tensions than I'm able to say. They will stick next, the images will stick next to whichever ones you carry with you. One other aspect about Steve Cary is worth mention. In addition to Quaker Meeting, Steve loved bad jokes, good parties, raucous cheers for Haverford College sports teams. Could those of you in the room who really enjoy parties and consider yourselves extroverts raise your hands? It's another group that, okay. Thank you. Great. Now I'd like to talk to the rest of you. I'm an introvert too. And notice how we made connection without you actually having to raise your hand. I'm going to pretend to be an extrovert for the next hour, though. And to those of you who are extroverts, if you've ever wondered what's going on in the minds of these very quiet people at the side of the room, maybe I can give you an example here. But above all, we need each other. Both sorts of, the two energies complement each other. The one other question I'd like to ask is, how many of you here are not Quakers or familiar with Quakers? Just about everyone. Good, because what I wanted to say is, if I slip into jargon, look at me puzzled or make a question mark in the air. And here's a frame that I'd kind of like to offer and kind of turn it into a question or a query. One way of describing kind of the origin of the Quaker movement was the Reformation moved the center of authority from the institution of the church to the scriptures. And part of George Fox's insight that fueled the early Quaker movement was to further shift the sense of authority to the inward experience of the Spirit. And the question that I'd like to ask here is, how do scriptural guides, such as parables or the prophetic voice, how do they appear in the inward life? How do they appear in what George Fox would call our experiment of experiments in faith? Okay, I take you back to it's now 1960. I'm sitting in a pew for the first time in my life in an old line Episcopal boarding school. I grew up with kind of no orientation towards any religion. And I left for boarding school with one parent who was really pretty cool with the action of religion, but one parent who carried quite a lot of anxiety about it. wanted to make sure that I fit in, that I didn't make missteps that would cause people to judge me or misjudge me. And this has been something that, there was a vibration around the home for a long time. And I found here that there was the first class that I took there, the first class that I sat in was one in sacred studies, taught by the chaplain, Reverend Cary, a man for whom the Gospels were very much alive and a personal guide, and one who withstood the jibes and sometimes ridicule of a bunch of either cocky or rather scared adolescents. The first sermon that I heard Reverend Fry as I'm sitting in the pew in the church was on the parable of the sower. He introduced the parables by saying that they are simple stories, easy to remember, and that their meaning will appear gradually to us over time. So the parable of the sower goes, Behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places, where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. And the parable goes on to explain how the seed is like the word of God, and that falls on the roadside is snatched away. That falls on shallow ground is like people who hear it but do not have the courage of their convictions when challenged. The thorny ground is like people who are distracted by the pressures and challenges of the world. Now, here, as I'm sitting in my pew, it's a high church sort of school, stucco walls in the church, wood benches about the color of these, and all facing a center row. So there's a wall across from me with stained glass windows, and the one right in front of me shows a sower casting his seed. And I was at that point starting to wonder, how many fold fruit do I have to show here to pass the course in sacred studies? A facetious way of saying it, but in a more serious sense. In the environment of the school, I felt like we would really be a disappointment if we didn't yield fruit 30 or 60 or 100-fold. And that combined with that mixed with 1 unit of parental anxiety, gave me a sense that I wasn't sure that I could pass, kind of in both senses of the term, either pass the course or live up to the expectations, some of which were explicit and easy enough, and some of which were harder for me to understand, and those were the ones that caused me a sense of anxiety. A couple of years later, spending a summer out in Wyoming with my, that I didn't know at the time, the person who was to become my wife. Certainly didn't know it at the time because I started dating someone else on the dig, who was a Quaker. And her family was the first family that I had run into who had sort of a very both real but casual sort of relationship with their faith. It was something that they talked about quite easily and openly. It was something that clearly meant a great deal to them. And I've forgotten whether it was at my request or their invitation, but attended a meeting with her and her family one day in Purchase Meeting House. And I think it was built in the late 1700s, high-ceilinged, hard wooden benches. And I kind of got lost in the hour of meditation. And at the end of the meeting, I was surprised when Wendy reached out her hand to shake mine. This was not our usual form of greeting. But symbolically, I guess got the sense of, you're welcome here. It wasn't a sense of, do you fit or do you pass? You're welcome here. And as I came to spend more time around friends, I realized that that welcome was really quite radical. It was a welcome at the root. I pretty soon started attending Framingham meeting, which was only about 2 or 3 miles away from the chapel with the stained glass window of the sower. And actually, that visual image of the stained glass, now that I think of it, it's almost as if the sower was casting his seed into the pews, which were arranged like very kind of deep furrows. I was then back teaching at the school, but was playing hooky on Sundays to attend friends' meeting. I need to shift for a moment from taking you back to places, just setting some of the next scenes. About the time of the last scene, my dad died. It was Jean and I married. We moved to New Haven, where I was going to pursue a graduate degree in geology. That summer in Wyoming that we'd spent had turned my attention to the natural environment so much that I switched majors as well. And I pretty soon found an accustomed seat at New Haven Friends Meeting, and soon found myself on a number of unaccustomed committees. I also plunged into the Department of Geology and Geophysics, got my degree there, and then stayed on as a postdoc and then a research scientist. Our 2 children, Lisa and Meg, were born then. And as time passed, though, my mom gradually kind of withdrew from our life. The level of, or the unit of parental anxiety that had, with which I was introduced to organized religion, turned out to be just one way in which she would reflect a fear of the external world. She gradually withdrew from most of her social connections, and ultimately received a sort of diagnosis of paranoia. She recovered to some degree. She moved to a retirement home near us and did get to know her daughters. But for her, friends was something she was still a little bit skeptical of what I was up to here. About late 1980s, a company that my dad had started in 1950 sold for what was a really startling amount of money. I abbreviated it as Histolam, which was the words going through my head when I went out to my car in the parking lot. Holy shit, that's a lot of money. And it had been, the value of the company had been creeping up, but due to some circumstances, it sold for 3 times more than we'd expected the week before. So it was really startling, and it was startling to my sense of identity, and now I had to own up to being part of the 1%. My mom and I agreed that her share of this pile of cash, on her death, she would leave to a charitable foundation that my dad had established in 1946 when he was broke. His brother had died a few years before, and he started over again. He married my mother. I came along when he was 60, and he named me after his brother and named the fund after his brother. So unlike some foundations, which reflect on the donor, for him it was really an expression of love for his brother and hope. So it then became a task to begin to see what would be appropriate as a memorial. My dad was part of an immigrant family, first generation, born in this country. My grandfather, an unschooled dairyman. And we began to have some conversations about that. We decided something in the field of education was appropriate. And we're thinking about it in a fairly abstract terms until my mother became ill. And it became clear she didn't have more than a year to live. At that point, she lived about a couple miles away from us, and I'd stop by and see her every day. And the barriers that had come up around the things that we could talk about remained. I could still be present and still do what I could to care for her, but things such as religion or things such as the work I was doing were really ones that were beyond what she felt comfortable in talking about. As she kind of grew worse and the winter came on, it was clear that we'd never really be able to have those conversations. I used to, or actually still do, bicycle a fair amount just for exercise and to clear my head. And one December day was out for a ride coming back from visiting her and pedaled by a nearby truck farm. It was just after sunset. It had snowed a bit a couple days before. The sky was turning purple in the twilight. There was snow filling the bottom of the furrows. And my heart at that point felt about as cold as the weather, realizing that this relation was coming soon to an end. And that in a way I hadn't quite passed in being a son. And as I looked out over the field, it suddenly occurred to me that if you'd cast a seed in those furrows at the moment, it would not sprout. But if you waited 4 months, it would, and bear fruit 100-fold. And I had this sudden, almost kind of wordless sense of the parable becoming one of time rather than one of space. And had a sense of being able to take a deep breath and thinking, this moment will pass, and what it leads to is something I can't see yet. But there is still, it's actually more than hope. There was still a sense of more that lay before. After my mother died, we went into kind of full energy work in trying to plan the new direction for the Memorial Fund. That sale and her death increased its assets by a factor of 100 in a couple months. So we went from one phone call a year to make distributions to realizing that we needed to be professionally staffed. I knew it would be a big mistake to try and operate it directly myself. And it would take me more than the rest of this hour to tell you why it would be a big mistake. And what we did was to go and talk to 30 or 40 people who were knowledgeable about education, the field that we wanted to work in, because it was the educational opportunities here that had transformed my father's life and his siblings' life, and the inability financially to access education that was one of the things that led to my mother's withdrawal from community. What happened in those conversations surprised me. I was, by this point I had 25 years in geophysics and was a certified nerd, and I was expecting analytical framings of, here what I really see as needs or opportunity. But what I found was I heard as well were stories of why people were doing the work that they did. Some of these stories lay next to the stories that I remembered my dad telling. Some of those stories took on profoundly new layers of meaning. One in particular that my dad had told about when he was a freshman in college in 1902, and how a friend of his had outwitted a professor who'd tossed him out of class by going to the basement and listening to through the heating grate to every word of the rest of the lecture. It wasn't until my dad told me that story for the 100th time, just before he died, that he mentioned that his friend was African American. And it wasn't until one of these conversations that I realized some of the significance of that my dad, as an immigrant dairyman's son, felt or looked as out of place at Harvard in 1902 as his friend Amos White did. And that story became, and I found out they'd stayed friends for the rest of their lives. There's a thick file of correspondence between them. And my dad had endowed a scholarship in Amos's name at Wilberforce, where he had taught for the latter part of his career. Amos had also become the first person of color in the 20th century to head a teacher training school in South Africa. And as I told this story once, I discovered, Amanda, that you'd read about Amos. So we decided to focus the fund on early care and education, but also to think about inclusion. How do we make education accessible? And that story, which was really a formative story in my childlike understanding of it, became then both sort of the psychic wheaties for me to explore or to try and reach out across boundaries of race, but also after a while became something of a crutch. I realized I needed to do some more work than just repeat the story that my dad had told me. One of the unaccustomed committees that I was at on Friends Meeting was, for a while, Ministry and Council. And I got a flyer to post about a retreat on emerging ministries, which normally I would have sort of posted without thinking about it, but read through it. And I didn't think of myself as emerging or as a minister, but as I read it, and it was a retreat for people who were looking for or felt they were about to embark on a new direction, a chance for reflection and discernment. And I raised my hand and signed up. It was in Greenfield, Massachusetts, at Woolman Hill, about 100 miles north of New Haven, starting on a Friday afternoon. And I-91 on a Friday afternoon is not a way to prepare for a retreat. So I took 2 days and bicycled. I had to get that far away from my desk. And I was expecting not to find too much in common with people there. After all, how much does this story resonate? Kid with crazy mother finds himself part of the 1%. Yeah, not expecting to find a lot of resonance here. But I felt, in a sense, that I needed to go to explore direction. There were about 30 people at the retreat. After a very brief housekeeping session, we went to small groups that we were going to return to during the course of the week. And the first small group, which we met for an hour, there was nothing on the agenda. So we sat there until one person said, well, why don't we share the stories of why we came? And we all nodded. And so she began, got partway through her story, and said, let me stop here. Let's each start our stories. And so the next person started. Then the third person picked up on something one of the first two had said. And the fourth person built on that. And by the time we'd gone around once, it was clear that there was just one story in the group that took many forms. But in all cases, it was people who had been through something that had caused suffering, done much of the work of healing, and were trying to discern whether what they had learned from this was something that they could offer to others as a gift, not a burden. And in language I only learned last week, there were 5 things that I heard people doing: facing facts, choosing life, reaching out, getting moving, and giving back. And I found I wasn't alone. I didn't have words for it then, but I realized it wasn't just my story. It was the story of us Quakers who were there that week. And that for all of us, it was not only possible, but it was necessary to move forward. And move forward for me not as a 1%er, but as a part of that circle. A couple years later, I'm finding myself kind of confused by all of the requests I'm getting as a foundation trustee to serve on boards or contribute to causes. And I realized I needed to step back and do some planning, or I'd kind of get swept away by what people expected of me. I repeated the same process that we'd done to set the direction for the fund. Just went out and talked to people. And this time it was about 20 people who worked in the nonprofit or civic sector in New Haven. I asked them all the same question. What's your vision for what you want to accomplish? And what gets in your way? And it took till the end of the entree, generally, before I could convince people that's all I really wanted to know. Or because it was a question they hadn't been asked very often. And I heard 2 yearnings coming out clearly. One was a yearning to be part of something larger than themselves, to work outside the boundaries of their organization for the greater good. But everyone found that that was difficult. It was difficult to create relations that could really withstand the challenges of true collaboration. And between the lines, I heard people expressing the desire for building those relations. The second thing that I heard, which really surprised me because the nonprofit sector is supposed to be sort of a values-based sector, was people said, I find my values are offended at work, or stuff's bubbling up in my heart that I don't know where to find a place for. And what they were, I think, asking for was support in manifesting what was most dear or precious to them. Again, something I found words for only a couple weeks ago in Howard Thurman's conversations. He once said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what brings you fully alive, and go do that. Because what the world needs is more people who are fully alive. And I heard people asking for a sense of support in becoming more fully alive in community. I was working at the time here with the colleagues, Susan Fowler, who is a UCC minister, and we'd kind of discerned these patterns together. And I was feeling also like I'm hearing yearnings here that I've experienced support for in Friends Meeting by processes such as clearness, by people who are willing to sit through conflict without judgment until the truth emerges. So without knowing any better, we started what we can call the Community Leadership Program. 9 sessions, 1 day over 9 months, 1 day a month over 9 months. And we both adopted things from our faith traditions. One of the ones that worked particularly, well, two things that we did sort of from the beginning. We worked with oral story, because that had been so important to me, and inviting other people just to speak from their sensory, the things they remembered feeling and seeing and hearing and touching, and inviting others just to keep them company as they rummaged through the attic of the memory. And with a sort of response that was always appropriate was for the listener just to ask, what do you want to know more about? And then that led into spending a session on clearness process. It was inviting a focus person to present a challenge that they were facing, where the people around them have the very easy to describe but very hard to follow task of asking only questions. And it was clear over the first year that we'd heard correctly. And people sensed our intent and supported us despite a really spectacular lack of skill on our part. My sense was that our accountability was to the cohort. And in particular, we were working with actually our evaluators in the room who came back with a report that she spoke to the people in the cohort in confidence and found that the people of color had kept issues, had found the session had been really useful to them, but they deliberately kept issues of race off the table because they saw that I and my colleague wouldn't be able to hold the room safe for the conversation that would need to happen. So, added a third leader the next year, a woman of color, and sort of a process of then continuing development occurred, or continuing sort of commitment on my part, being in up to the neck with 20 people who were looking to me as leader of the group. I had to either deliver, or when I failed, to make it clear that I would try and make it right. Worked with another, I want to give credit or a nod here particularly to Heidi Brooks, another woman of color who I've been working with for the last 6 years, who is a brilliant facilitator, and we've continued to develop the program. But in the third year, the last session, a very heated discussion started, partly around race, and the other leaders and I were thrown out of the room. And I thought we had failed, and that this work in preparation had been for naught. Turned out that cohort continued to meet on its own, and for the next year decided to talk about issues of race. And I realized I hadn't failed, I just chickened out too quickly and mistaken what I saw as conflict for the signs of, and couldn't immediately see the signs of real work going on underneath. I stumbled into meeting one of the most accomplished storytellers in the nation, Donald Davis. Went to one of his workshops. Thought it was for vacation. And took what I'd learned from him and shamelessly applied it in my work, and went back to him 3 years later and said, I'm finding how powerful story is as a vehicle for approaching community building. Would you be willing to do a week's workshop for those who are working in community building and social justice, who could really use story but don't know it? And we just had the 23rd of that sequence of weeks last week. My partner in producing it, Catherine Conant, I think wonderfully summarized some of the experience. She said, people come in saying, without putting into words, am I enough? Will they hear me? Will they accept me? Tell me that I'm not beyond redemption. We offer nothing more than witness, and offer space for coming to reconciliation, healing, and acceptance. And let's see. And again, I think of an attitude of friends that resonates so powerfully amongst those outside of the society of friends. But I've been working with individuals for a number of years, and had been either in front of the room working to hold the space, or working with really skilled people to do that, to meet Nionu, and we realized we had more of a common vision than we would have imagined. And we've been working together now for the last 3 or 4 years on trying to transfer this skill of holding space and awareness of how the dynamics of a group are forming to the organizations themselves. And our core intent is to support New Haven movements and organizations, at least New Haven for now, in building internal practices and external interactions that embody social and economic justice, that increase organizational effectiveness, and in which people are consciously aware of how they are creating their own reality. One of the deals that Neonu and I cut to begin with was to maintain an alignment between our operations and our mission, and to have work with a third party to hold us accountable, to make sure that we were not perpetuating the same sorts of patterns we were trying to break. That's led to some of the most challenging and rewarding conversations that I've had professionally. Boy, I made a note on the train here, and it was a piece of rough track. This stories, and the people that I've worked closest with here, Neonu and Heidi and Donald Davis and Catherine, are the ones that are really hardest to describe in story. But their witness, support, guide, and the patterns that they've offered have been a huge source of support and energy. So much so in a way that I found my connection to my home meeting kind of diminishing. The work that I was doing, I felt, was really personally challenging and alive. I could see how it was touching other people, and it was holding difficult conversations where we discovered how much vitality there was in failing, taking a deep breath, and then agreeing to try something different. And it pulled me away from meeting as my center. And I think these reasons are particular to me, but the experience, like maybe universal, just as my experience of the parable of the sower is very particular, but the way the parables can speak to us in unexpected ways is universal. So I'd like to tell you a couple stories of voices that I've heard that have acted for me as parable or prophetic voice. And I have the permission of both of these people to retell their stories. One friend of mine, Eric's father disappeared from his family's life when he was 14. They were desperately poor, lived with his mother and several siblings in a room in what was otherwise a crack house in Stamford. He had lived in Norwalk before, and one day was taking the train back to Norwalk to visit some friends and wondering, how am I going to make it from here? Who can I follow? Who can be a pattern or example for me? And got on the commuter railroad, Metro North, and there was a man sitting on one of the seats, African American like Eric, briefcase, suit, yellow socks, really put together. And Eric said, that's what I want to be. And he continued to ride that train and would see that man who continued to be an inspiration for him. And he went on to, had to make money, worked for the post office. When his kids got to be school age, he realized he had to go to college. He argued for 5 years with the postmaster to put a bookshelf in the cafeteria. And as soon as the bookshelf was put in, he said, thank you. Now I can read. Now I quit. Went on to lead a nonprofit, LEAP, which provides support and opportunity for kids who are in the same situation that he was. And then was recruited to start another nonprofit organization that was providing job training for jobs that existed in the area for people who didn't think that they would ever be able to get a good job. He told another story of being in Florida once visiting relatives, and by an absolutely improbable set of circumstances met his father. And he was really proud to show him what he could become, what he had become. And then realized that his father was mentally ill and couldn't see him. But he said, I had spent my whole life trying to be something that would be worthy of him. And I suddenly kind of got the chills as he told this, because my mother disappeared from my life when I was 14 and could never see kind of the work that I was doing. And I thought in a way that I was doing work that was small and particular and that had meaning for me. But seeing it reflected in Eric, I realized, no, this is a larger story here. And it's a larger story not only of the human condition, but I think it's also a larger story of some of what friends have to offer. The second story came from this January, again, one of these community leadership programs sessions. We'd built up a fair amount of trust over the fall. And one woman told a story of coming back to New Haven on the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech in the Marsh on Washington. There was also riding Metro North, one seat open, a briefcase in the seat. May I sit there? I don't want your black skin touching mine. And she said, I was frozen. I was taken back to when I was 7 years old and had encountered something like that for the first time. And as I looked around the car, there was only one other person of color. No one said anything. And one person of color did get up and offer me to give me a seat. So one of our, as I said, our rules is it's always fair to ask, what do you want to know more about? Someone inquired, how is the 7-year-old Virginia? She said, 7-year-old's just fine. It's the 57-year-old I want you to look at. And she said, I'm really disturbed. I don't know what to make of no one speaking. How far have we come? Where were people on that car? What's the world that I'm in? 2 days later, I was sitting in meeting for worship, looking around the room and saying, it's about the same composition as that Metro North car. How is this room like that Metro North car? And I realized Virginia's voice was, for me, beginning to act like a prophetic voice, because it was starting to act as a metaphor, letting me see the space that I was in different ways, and letting me feel the gap between the world as it is and the world as it might be. I had, almost every person of color that I know has had times of feeling alone and at risk. Dawn's coming to Marblehead kind of slow here. But at an emotional level, I felt something different for the first time, because I could begin to feel my own emotions began to fill in the images that Virginia's story had left. My friend Eric, I mentioned before, just once in the course of one of these sessions came up with a wonderful riff on Cornell West and Ephesians 3. In order to serve the people, you have to love the people. In order to love the people, you have to know the people. And in order to know the people, you have to be open to the discomfort of learning their stories. Okay. So I think the most disruptive thing I ever did was listen. And action came easier afterwards, though not necessarily swiftly. And I find that my path in the secular world has really affirmed Quaker practice, the sense of looking for that of the divine in others, looking for the testimonies that others have to give, even when they think they have no testimony to give. And I hear, and the words for this for me are still emerging, that the Quakers and the secular world are asking for each other. I hear Quakers, or at least on this retreat, looking to turn their own experience into a ministry, to reach out beyond themselves, and to be grounded and centered and clear when they're doing it. And I hear an external world longing to be heard, longing for people to find something good in them. So the Quaker view of the light within really is an affirmation that others are capable. And that is a gift in a world that has such a fear of inadequacy. And I hear Quakers also looking to reach beyond the Quaker bubble, to take the title of the December Friends Journal. And I hear the world looking for a safe space to begin the next stage of their growth. I heard, thanks to Neonu, Jerry White speak 2 weeks ago. He won the Nobel Prize in 1997 for a campaign to ban landmines. And he himself had lost a leg to a landmine. And I've never seen anyone work, listen, or engage a room like that. And he said what he looks for, he says some people can be stuck in the past with self-pity, resenting, blaming, and taking. He said the same people at different times can show courage, humor, humility, perseverance, and generosity. And in between those two come face facts, choose life, reach out, get moving, give back. The same voice that I heard at the retreat. And as I see it now, those are not necessarily mindsets. We're not all one mindset. We're not all feeling as stuck in the past or at worst victims. We're not all of the time feeling like survivors. And we're not all of the time many acting as leaders. But I think we all have those elements within us. And what Jerry was so wonderful at doing is just catching the moment when different people would show the spark of surviving and leading and capitalizing it and calling out and getting others to move. So my personal renewal with friends has been an understanding of the power of our practice. And the faith has flowed from the practice now much more than the practice flows from the faith. And I think the question is, what do we have to offer as patterns and examples? I think much more than we may imagine. And what will we see as patterns and examples? I think also much more than we can imagine. And I think that to listen to our neighbors as if they were prophets is a necessary step on the path to justice. So, thank you. I have taken up a goodly chunk of time. If any of you need to move on with your evenings, please do so. If there's anything you'd like to know more about or a comment that you'd like to make, I'd welcome it.
Would you like to call on people, Bill, so if you see them before I do?
Okay.
Thank you so much. I've done some work with anti-racism work, and one of the things that I became concerned about recently was the call out for stories. And so I've been saying to people, and maybe this is wrong, and I would love your thought on this, that sometimes we use stories before the community is really ready. I'm wondering how that fits in some of what you were saying about the explosion and the running from the room, if that was part of it.
Could you say a little bit more about that last part? I was starting to.
I've had the experience of a lot of us who are white pleading for stories from African Americans in particular. Right. Mm-hmm. And I haven't heard them give the stories of themselves. Right. And often I find the situations are set up so that that's the way it happens. Wondering about what your experience is in that regard.
Right. A couple of things. It is a frequent pattern that people the nature of privilege is you sometimes aren't aware of it. And a common pattern is for people in privilege to ask, who are not aware of it and its ramifications, to ask those who are harmed by it to explain it to them. I think that puts the person who's not at privilege at a risk. And so I'm in groups. What I would tend to do is start work with story on things that are not about issues, but just about our memories. And it's, who would you like the other people, who in your life do you wish other people in this room knew? Is there a place that you used to love to go as a child that you can't go to anymore, but you could take us to? And to work into story from these kind of personal memories. And as we, as a group, develop sort of the practice of listening and holding each other's stories, that then offers a model for how, when the stories get more difficult, we can stay with each other. And also, if in terms of looking at stories around issues like of race, there are certainly patterns and structures there around which Nionu is probably more expert than most people that I know.
First, thank you very much, Bill, for that. That's a great story itself, your story. You've been involved in a lot of things programmatically in New Haven, particularly in leadership and early education. So I wanted to ask you, what do you consider to be your single biggest success programmatically, and what is your biggest disappointment?
Oh, that's a hard question. The successes I sometimes measure just in people's affects and seeing how they carry themselves differently. And in a way, I find the things that are probably most successful I'll never know about. In terms of what I can point to are a number of, collaborations that have started around New Haven because of people who've been through CLP, recognizing that they'd had the common experience, being able to speak more openly and candidly, and making the collaboration happen. I've heard lots of stories of friendships forming across boundaries of dimensions of difference, and those friendships being mutually supportive and enduring. I've heard stories about people recruiting others to their boards or hiring others. So much in the way of network. And it's actually, I think it is, for me in a way, time to raise the stakes a little bit. And rather than filling kind of what I had perceived as a felt need. My biggest mistake, that's again hard to say. I think it's probably not getting on the ball sooner. The language that we use in CLP is a mistake. Wow, here's something we can learn from. So the biggest mistakes I've made are the ones I haven't learned anything from yet. I don't mean to sound evasive, but it's hard to answer that question. And I think here, others may be able to give better witness to that than I. Please.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's very moving. There's two things that I wonder about. One is that one of the most powerful spiritual practices that I've entered into is I'm part of two groups that meet once a month to tell that are white people actually, to tell stories about racism, and what I've experienced in that is that people sort of feel like they can bring their full selves, but also that we get into the practice of seeing it. One of the most gratifying things was somebody who said, I used to not think about this every day, and now I think about it all the time. And I think a lot about that becoming a foundational spiritual practice for Quakers, that we embed that in our meeting communities to really go into those conversations and practice seeing and thinking about that, because I think it's profoundly spiritual to undo that kind of barriers. And I wonder what you think about that. And then the other question that I have, as long as I've known about what you and Nionu have been doing in New Haven, I've had a longing for you all to be working with national Quaker organizations to do the same thing. and I think the need is so great, and I just wonder about that as well.
To the first question or comment. and to the second.
Let the record reflect that for the audio tape that Bill just bowed in the direction of the questioner.
Oh.
Obviously, I thank God for the work you and Neonu have been wedded to. So thank you for your loyalty. Thank you for your tenacity. But ultimately, thank you for the depth, width, and breadth of your love. Thank you. The piece that strongly touched me was when you spoke of the father who was mentally ill, who was incapable of seeing, and how that touched you because you knew that thread tenderly. And so what I'm wanting to point to is for each of us in the room, but especially the truth of it is for each of us in the room, and I'm going to say, and especially for those who have been marginalized, I choose to believe that the greatest sin is the inability to see the divinity of another human. It is the gravest sin. And so my prayer is that we truly recognize the depth, breadth, and width of our brokenheartedness when we don't see each other. And in the process of truly seeing, my belief is that when we truly have the capacity to see, then we step forward to support, assist, and inspire. So thank you for the work that you are doing.
A thought that comes to me is that at times we all need refuge. And for me, the coming to Quakers was the refuge that I needed at that point in my life for continued spiritual growth. But staying too long in refuge can lead to either being stuck, a lack of growth, or at worst, victimhood. So the not hearing the other needs we need refuge so we can have the sense of safety and breathe to heal or to hear. And that refuge is precious, and our memories of the places that have been refuges for us are precious. And we also, I think, for our own spiritual health, at the right time, need to continue to move forward and step out from out of the refuge. Demi.
Could I go with
Sure.
Viv here just because it's closer?
Sure.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. I have a sense that the Religious Society of Friends is at a threshold now, where either there's going to be a breakaway or a breakthrough. And for that reason, I sent out an email about this session to a number of people saying, please come here. So I'm going to, if I can, bring you back to that second question that Lucy asked. What might we do And it's not simply for you, perhaps, but for all of us to think about, how do we step toward? How do we listen? How do we be present to one another in those places that are painful, where we would rather separate? And might you and Niunu offer something in the way of, I know that there's not a turnkey, but what have you learned from which we can learn as well?
That, I feel two parts to that question. One is, for me, the boundary between the friends and the outside world seems more permeable. I mean, because I have felt this support and heard the voices of those from outside of friends. I think that what Friends has to offer can attract people to the Society of Friends. I think the revitalization can come from without as well as within, if that's as you put it. And I think as you said, there certainly are patterns, many of which are unconscious, of exclusion. And those can be worked on. My daughter Lisa actually just did her master's thesis on that. In terms of what works, I don't have a particular specific answer. I know lots of people with pieces of answers, and more of a conversation there. And I think the question of how do we get the psychiquedes to start to do our internal work, I think personally it's been in small steps, and small steps that I continue to celebrate in terms of gratitude for the people who helped me along with them. I had a thought when driving to meeting one day when I was feeling the disconnect particularly, and said, well, I've never asked to be eldered. And thought, well, my bad. The sense, what I've found is a simple but fairly basic thing is establishing relationships where you say, hey, here's something I'm working on. Let me know when I'm doing X, Y, or Z or falling short. And my experience, and others may have very different experiences, so I claim no authority here, is it's steady, it's increment. For me, it's always been incremental work, but it accelerates.
It seems to me your mic is off in some way or another.
Okay.
It's at least not picking up.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for. It's on. Okay, and thank you for calling me out on that email.
Bill, thank you so much for these stories. I would love to hear how you and Niunu, and I know you work with others. I spoke with Ingrid Lakey the other day. I would like a picture of like the organizational chart or what each of you does to make these things possible organizationally.
Okay. Let me just check. Is this mic live now? No. Okay. It may have just slipped away from my mouth. It's not on? Okay, well, okay.
It did not sound like it on that side.
Okay. I will swallow this mic instead. An org chart would be difficult to describe. The foundation has an organizational chart. I started CLP with a partner, and others came along, and we just sort of have a negotiated relationship. Likewise with Donald, I found in Catherine a real partner who could do the production work, and Donald was the master of introduction to story. In CEIO, it's most of it is, I think it's a vision we share in common, but the execution plan is largely Neonu's work. I had gotten myself more badly overextended than I had realized. And this was something that I didn't negotiate well ahead of time. So Neonu has acted really as executive of that. And I've been present particularly with the capacity builders, those that who help with, such as Ingrid, who do the training in support of the organizations. Likewise, in CLP, we now have a fellows program. There are 2 cohorts, and one's led by people who've just been through the program. And in both of those, it's the capacity building team or the fellows or the staff of the Memorial Fund are extremely strong communities of practice. And I think that's really the central part of, one of the central parts of the organization. We're a group of peers who effectively commit to each other's continued support and learning and effectiveness. And one of the things I would really love to do is try and connect the dots a little bit more in the future. Neonu, would you like to just say more to that? Let's see if we could, back there and then over here.
I am. We are Aaron's there. Who did you point to, darling?
Bill, sitting here and reflecting on my own personal experiences being a very intricate part of story, I just want to say thank you. I was a part of story for 2 different sessions, and hearing the stories of individuals who did not have the opportunity to speak openly, to share their heart, and to be in a room, to be in a safe space, and with a facilitator and a master of working with people like Donald Davis was a true gift to me, Bill. And if anyone could get me to come out in all this weather, it would be you. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to share my story. And I shared 2 very sensitive stories. So I would just like to say thank you publicly in front of all our friends.
You are welcome, and that invitation that I made is one that you don't have to accept. And thank you for accepting it so fully and for helping to create that space. Okay, I think over here next and then.
I do appreciate the tender story that you shared with us and all of the nuance around it. I would like to hear more about the moment when you felt perhaps not so close to your monthly meeting, that was not the place you were getting your nurture, and maybe a little more about what that meant and whether that has changed at all over time.
Yes, it has changed with time. Part of it was busyness. I found with these new responsibilities, I started declining to serve on some committees. Part of it was when I was really trying to learn more about how to lead a group. I'd go to a meeting and I'd have a facilitator's ear on. And I was thinking, this is not worshipful. And I was stuck in that place at the moment. I never felt a sense of the meeting letting me down. It was more that I was going into a place and I didn't know how to invite the meeting along. But there's been, I think most of the cohorts of community leadership program have had someone from the meeting in them. So there is actually, I don't mean to make it sound like a big gap, and now I do attend meeting almost every Sunday I'm in New Haven. So it's something that has seems to have passed. And I have, I think, a new appreciation for Friends' manner of worship. I particularly found Rex Ambrose's book, Light to Live By, spoke very much both to my condition and to the work I'm doing in the outside world.
Are you raising your hand, Gary?
I really appreciate, Bill, the way in which you see the spiritual formation and the spiritual communication that happens in Quaker circles to be something which the world needs and not to be held within the container. And it seems to me that whenever we have the refuge or the haven of being in a community, we treasure that. But there's something going way back to the disciples that wants to sit and circle the wagons. And somehow the more precious it is, the less we should be circling wagons. The more the insight that we have paradoxically, it seems to me, if I'm hearing you correctly, breaks out of the exclusivity and is a universal, is something which can, as you gather spiritual energy and all of those who find Quaker meeting for worship to give us energy, it's not necessarily to build up Quaker meetings. It's to go forth. And when we really hear the Sermon on the Mount, when we really hear the Beatitudes of what is blessed, it turns things upside down, which again I think is why it's so important to hear the stories of those who do not share privilege with a lot of the folks in the room, who do not share assuming haven and refuge, so that the refuge can be expansive, and blessed are those who are meek and those who are hungering and those who are poor and those who mourn.
Thank you. Oh wait, I just see Amanda's hand. Was there an? Oh. Okay. Okay.
Are you closing, Jen? Not before you, Amanda.
No. I wouldn't do that if I were you.
You could. I feel vulnerable, so I would be okay with you closing, but but it would be incomplete. So I just want to say thank you. That parable spoke to me, and I didn't know yours. Even though I've known you for a while, I didn't know the story of the entry into the 1%. And so that was good to know how it happened. And one of the things that I've been struck with is how, because of that privilege, you don't have to put yourself out there. You could live a pretty protected life and be surrounded by people who will congratulate you on all the good that you do. And instead you took a more vulnerable path to where be with people who wouldn't necessarily be happy with you all the time, or who wouldn't be happy in the being in the face of knowing you with what privilege you have, in the face of what they don't have and what they need. So I think it's important to affirm that, who you are, what you're bringing, what you've accepted, the responsibility you've accepted with those gifts. And I want you to know that the stories that you told tonight, it was a funny little talk tonight, you know? It was a funny little weaving of things, you know? And it was a beautiful piece of ministry, because it took us, it gave us lots of things to come up against. It seems to me like the work that you're doing with CEIO, with Neonu, and the work that you've done with CLP, Community Leaders Program, it feels like you're going from creating space for individuals to more structural work. And in one area, you have a lot of strength and comfort. And that would be in the individual level. Darlene spoke to that. And then that structural work, that's more uncomfortable. And your voice got very quiet. And I guess what I'm just here to say to you, let it go. You know? You said failures, I forget how you put it. Oh, wow, what can we learn from it? And so in that new battlefield or zone, you know, you have something. You don't have to defer. You do know something. And I'm grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in a conversation that you were part of, I was asked, what makes me angry? And I was saying, you know, I don't do anger well. I don't associate it with productive spaces. But as I realized, you know, I'm seeing that places or spaces like CEIO or CLP can be created reliably. It happens year after year. Why doesn't it happen more frequently? Why isn't it part of our larger culture? And I'm kind of starting to get a little bit more worked up about that. It did take me a long time also. Okay, I see I got some work to do in the getting worked up level. You want to close it off quick, Jen? But you know, my path has been one I've kind of, and I'm not sure how much of it is the, well, I'm not sure what the origin is, but I have been slow to make the transition between what's particular to me and what's more universal. And this, both invitation, the preparation, and this evening has been a tremendous affirmation. So, thank you. I mean, as Donald says, when you're telling a story, it's actually a conversation. People's faces are telling you what they're seeing, what they want to hear more about. And that's the only way we find our voice, is to open our mouths and see what comes out and find the way to say it that feels right and that resonates. So, thank you.
I want to reflect back at you the gratitude and the appreciation that I'm seeing for your message, and hearing that you didn't just speak to us, you spoke to us. And I suppose in thanking you, I want to thank everyone in the room for being a part of that conversation, because the most powerful lectures that I've witnessed leave us moving here or here, And I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing movement. And I'm hearing a call for more. And I'm hearing a drawing out from you. How can we be different? How can we remain in discomfort? How can we be imperfect together as a society of friends towards that which you and Neonu point to in your work and others here seek and aspire to in their journeys? And so whereas normally in this role I close with wishing people safe travels and a goodbye, I'd like to close tonight with an invitation instead of a goodbye. Let it keep working on you. Share the message or whatever got prompted in you with 1 or 2 or 10 other people, and answer the questions that you were asking Bill among those people. Find your group, find the base of connection that will help you get to those answers. Seek out expertise when you need it, and look to the inner guide when you can, and join with others in authentically listening, so that we can find that reality amongst ourselves as a society of friends and a society that's far broader than Quakers. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have a copy? Are you going to make that available?
I'm going to I only wrote notes because I didn't want to be reading.
Okay.
But I will transcribe the.
That'd be great.
Transcribe.
I'd love to get a copy.
Right. Yeah, we did videotape it. So.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
think you and Steve would have enjoyed it.
Right.
I agree. Yeah, we would have had a good time.
Thank you.
I didn't have to worry about your being bold.
Okay, good. Good. Thank you. You're welcome.
You did a good job, Bill.
Thank you, Michael.
Very good. You were yourself.
That was.
Bill, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Really, it was great.
Great.
It was
you.
great. I hope that as time goes on, we
You're still on.
no, you're still hot.